She was denied entry to the bank she founded, mocked as if she were nothing. By sundown, the man who laughed at her would be escorted out, and the ledger that built an empire would expose everything. Elena Cruz stepped out of the Blacktown car with a sense of quiet purpose, the morning air cool against her face as she pulled her plain coat tighter around her shoulders. She had chosen not to wear the tailored suits and diamond pins that usually marked her as the billionaire founder of Crescent Bank. Today, she wanted to walk into her flagship branch as an ordinary person, to see what her customers experienced without titles or escorts. The glass doors reflected her face back at her, not the polished image from business magazines, but a woman with tired eyes, hair tucked neatly but simply, carrying only a small leather bag. She moved toward the entrance, already noticing the impatient shuffle of people waiting in line for the ATM, their eyes heavy with worry. The security guard stepped forward before she could pull open the door. He looked her over, his gaze landing on the coat that covered her, the absence of jewelry, the worn shoes she had chosen on purpose. His expression hardened as if she were a problem to be managed, not a client to be welcomed. "Banking hours are restricted to account holders with premium appointments," he said, his voice clipped and dismissive. Elena blinked, surprised, then offered a polite smile. "I am here to meet with someone inside." The guard shook his head, already pulling the door tighter. "Not dressed like that, ma'am. Try customer service hotline. They'll sort you out." A couple nearby snickered, turning away quickly when she glanced at them. Another woman in a sharp business suit walked past without challenge, the guard opening the door smoothly for her, his voice changing into professional courtesy. Elena remained outside, the humiliation sharp in her chest as she felt the eyes of strangers skim over her, weighing and discarding her as if she did not matter. She pressed her hand against the cool leather of her bag, steadying herself, remembering why she had come here unannounced. She wanted to see the truth. Now she had it, raw and ugly, at the doorstep of her own creation. For a moment she thought of her mother, standing outside a bank years ago with an eviction notice in her trembling hands, denied a small loan that could have saved their home. Elena had promised herself then that if she ever had power, no one would feel that same cold dismissal. Yet here she was, locked out of the institution she had built with her own vision, treated like a burden rather than a client. The irony stung, almost enough to make her laugh, though her throat tightened instead. She stepped back, her heels clicking against the sidewalk, lifting her chin as if the sting of shame could be turned into steel. Customers passed without knowing they brushed shoulders with the woman who owned the bank. Inside those glass doors, her staff carried out policies under her name, yet they did so with arrogance she had never intended. Elena inhaled slowly, the city sounds around her blending into a single steady rhythm. The guard gave her one last dismissive glance before returning to his post. She turned away, but in her chest a fire was beginning to burn. She had seen enough to know the lockout was not just a mistake, it was a message, and she would answer it. Elena remained near the entrance, her breath steady, though her pulse hammered with quiet rage, when the glass doors slid open, and a tall man in a navy suit stepped out, adjusting his cufflinks as though the world existed only to admire him. Derek Mallory, branch manager of Crescent's flagship location, carried himself with the smugness of someone who thought power was permanent, his smile polished but cold. The guard leaned close to whisper something, and Derek's eyes landed on Elena with a quick scan that dismissed her in an instant. He tilted his head, a smirk curving at the corner of his mouth, then approached her as though dealing with a nuisance rather than a client. "Ma'am, if you're here to complain about fees or to beg for an extension on your loan, we can't help you at the door," he said smoothly, the words coded in condescension. "Try the customer service hotline. They'll be able to explain the policies in simpler terms." Elena kept her face calm, though her stomach tightened at the assumption that she was desperate and unimportant. She studied Derek in silence, noting the expensive watch gleaming on his wrist, the easy way he blocked her view of the lobby where customers lined up at teller counters. His voice carried just loud enough for the nearby clients to hear, and a few exchanged knowing glances, one man shaking his head as if grateful it wasn't him being spoken down to this time. Derek mistook her silence for submission and leaned slightly closer, lowering his voice but not his arrogance. "Trust me, the line inside is for people with actual business. You don't look like someone who qualifies." The words struck harder than the lockout had, Not because they were new, but because they echoed every barrier she had seen ordinary families face when seeking dignity. Elena wanted to reveal herself in that moment, to tell him she was the founder, the architect of every branch and policy, the reason his paycheck cleared each month. But she held her tongue. Instead, she let him talk, his smirk widening as he believed himself clever. "You'd be surprised how many people think they can just walk in here and demand special treatment. This is Crescent, not a charity," he added, clearly enjoying the small crowd that now half watched their exchange. She straightened her shoulders, her voice calm though her anger coiled beneath each word. "And if someone came here with something important, something that could change the direction of this bank, would you still tell them to call a hotline?" Derek gave a short laugh, dismissive and sharp, waving a hand as if brushing away dust. "Important people don't show up looking like you do," he replied. "If they matter, they schedule an appointment. If not, well, they find out quickly where they stand." His laughter lingered, cold and careless, as he turned to walk back inside. Helena watched him go, the glass doors closing behind him, his arrogance reflected like a warning. He had no idea the woman he mocked held his career in her hands, and soon, she promised herself, he would learn exactly how wrong he had been. Elena stood frozen on the sidewalk long after Derek's laughter faded, her reflection in the glass doors staring back at her like a stranger. The humiliation pressed into her chest, but beneath it came a memory so sharp she could almost feel the sting of winter air against her skin. She was 12 years old again, standing beside her mother on the cracked steps of their old apartment building, a folded notice clutched in her mother's trembling hands. The paper was thin but heavy with words that meant displacement, words that announced they had 3 days to vacate because rent was past due and the bank had denied the emergency loan her mother had begged for. Elena remembered the way her mother's lips had moved silently, whispering prayers between sobs, her eyes darting to the window where their belongings already looked like they no longer belonged to them. The image burned into Elena's memory as though carved into stone. The banker that day had not looked at them with kindness, only with a tired shrug as he pushed back the application across the desk. "Insufficient collateral," he had said, as if a mother and daughter with steady school records and honest intentions were nothing but numbers on a page. Elena had watched her mother break in that moment, her back no longer straight, her hands gripping the edge of the counter as though holding on to the last shred of dignity. They had carried boxes down the stairs alone, neighbors peeking out of doors but offering no help, and Elena had promised herself one thing. As she balanced her school books on top of a box of dishes, she would never allow a piece of paper to define her worth again. Now, outside her own bank, the same sting returned, sharper because it came from an institution she had built with her own name. She had vowed Crescent would be different, that it would stand as a bridge for families who needed a chance, not as a wall that shut them out. Yet Derek's mocking smile and the guard's dismissive tone showed her how easily vision could be corrupted once it passed into other hands. She clenched her fists at her sides, feeling the soft leather of her bag press into her palm. Inside of it, the small ledger her father had once filled with notes on fairness and responsibility. His words echoed as clearly as her mother's cries had years before. "Numbers can wound, or they can heal." Elena inhaled slowly, letting the memory settle not as weakness but as fuel. She thought of the cold nights on relatives' couches, the meals skipped so her mother could save enough to start again, the endless forms that never seemed designed for people like them. Every scar of that eviction lived in her bones, and now those bones carried her into boardrooms and headlines. She had risen because of the very pain Derek so carelessly inflicted on others, and she would not allow him or anyone else to turn Crescent into the same machine that had once broken her family. She turned away from the glass doors, her jaw set, her stride steady, knowing the humiliation she had endured today would become the spark that reignited her promise. Crescent would be corrected, even if she had to tear it down to rebuild it. Elena walked away from the branch, her heels clicking on the pavement, her face calm though her heart burned with a storm she refused to show. The crowd had already forgotten her, their eyes shifting to phones and schedules, but Elena carried the sting with her like an old scar reopened. As she turned the corner, she slipped her hand into her purse, fingers brushing against the smooth, worn leather of the book she always carried. Her father's ledger was small enough to fit in her palm, its brown cover softened by time, its corners bent from years of use. But to her it felt heavier than gold. She pulled it out for just a moment, the scent of aged paper rising faintly as though her father's presence lingered between the lines. Every page was filled with his handwriting, not neat but strong, numbers written beside names, small calculations of loans he had once offered neighbors when the banks turned them away. He had been a teacher of mathematics, but in their community he became something more. A man people trusted when institutions closed their doors. Elena could still remember nights at the kitchen table, her father running a finger along the columns as he explained each entry. "See this," he would tell her. "These numbers are not just figures. They represent a family keeping their home, a student paying for books, a widow able to buy medicine. Numbers can wound, or they can heal. It depends on the hand that writes them." At 12, she had not fully understood, but at 34, standing at the head of her own empire, she knew those words were a compass she could not abandon. She opened the book now, stopping at a page where her father had written about a family of 5 who needed a small loan to cover rent after the father lost his job. Elena remembered delivering that envelope of money with him, the gratitude in their faces, the way hope had returned to eyes dulled by fear. It was not charity, her father had explained. It was dignity, a bridge until they could stand again. Elena traced the faded ink with her fingertip, feeling the weight of those lessons press against the anger in her chest. She had carried the ledger through college exams, through the first investor meetings where men twice her age dismissed her ideas, through every deal that shaped Crescent Bank into a force in the financial world. It was more than a relic, it was a promise that her father's vision would not die. The leather cover creaked softly as she closed it again, slipping it back into her purse with care, like one would return a jewel to a safe. Inside that branch, Derek had mocked her, blind to the power that rested not in appearances but in principles. The ledger reminded her that she was not fighting for titles or profits. She was fighting for the same dignity her mother had once been denied, the same fairness her father had embodied in ink and paper. She tightened her grip on the purse strap, her jaw set with resolve. If Crescent had lost its way, then she would bring it back, no matter how many walls she had to tear down to make it happen. Elena returned the next morning dressed the same way she had been the day before, her plain coat wrapped tightly around her frame, her hair pulled back simply, her purse with the ledger resting against her side, like a hidden shield. She moved quietly among the crowd, blending in with the anxious faces who lined up for appointments and teller windows. No one looked at her twice, which was exactly what she wanted. From the corner of the lobby, she sat in a chair meant for waiting clients, her eyes calm but sharp, taking in every detail of how her staff treated those who came seeking help. What she saw made her stomach twist with anger. A young couple approached the desk, their accents thick as they struggled with English words, trying to explain they had questions about a loan. The banker on duty rolled her eyes and switched to a rehearsed speech about policies, speaking faster than necessary, not even bothering to slow down or offer translation services. The couple looked more confused with each passing sentence until finally they left with bowed heads, whispering to each other in Spanish, their hope crushed at the very place meant to support them. Elena gripped her purse, her father's words echoing in her memory. Numbers can wound, or they can heal. Here, they had been used as weapons, shutting doors instead of opening them. A few minutes later, she overheard another exchange. An older man with calloused hands pleaded with a loan officer for more time to make his payments. His voice, unsteady as he explained his wife's illness had drained their savings. The officer barely looked up from his screen, repeating coldly that penalties would apply and foreclosure proceedings could begin if payment was not made within the week. Then, as the man turned away in defeat, the officer chuckled softly to his colleague, calling him another hopeless case. Elena felt her blood rise at the cruelty. The casual way lives were reduced to files and fees. She stayed the entire day, moving from seat to seat, pretending to fill out forms while her ears caught fragments of conversations. She heard tellers pushing credit cards with hidden fees to families who clearly did not understand the fine print. She saw Derek walk past twice, each time wearing the same smug smile, praising staff for selling products rather than serving people. And through it all, she realized with growing horror that Crescent had become the very monster she had once sworn to destroy. The institution that bore her name was behaving like the cold banks of her childhood, the ones that had turned her family away when they needed compassion most. As the hours passed, the weight in her chest grew heavier, not just anger but betrayal. as though her father's ledger had been mocked along with the clients. She thought of the night he had told her that fairness was the only true wealth, and she promised herself she would not let Crescent stand as it was. She would tear the arrogance from its foundation, expose the rot, and rebuild it into something worthy of his legacy. That night, Elena sat at her small writing desk, the ledger open beside her as if her father were watching, his words guiding her hand. She opened her laptop and logged into the customer portal of her own bank, not as the CEO, but as an ordinary client. She chose her pseudonym carefully, typing the name Bridge Builder, because that was what she believed banking should be, a way to connect people to opportunity rather than pushing them deeper into despair. Her fingers moved quickly over the keys as she wrote a long and detailed complaint. She described the way the young couple had been dismissed because of their accent, the cruelty of the officer who mocked the sick man begging for help, the predatory offers pushed on to customers without explanation. She included the times, the names, the exact words she had overheard, building a clear and undeniable case. When she finished, she read it over slowly, making sure the language was plain and the message sharp. She clicked submit and sat back, waiting to see what her team would do when faced with truth from the people they claimed to serve. The next day, Elena returned to the branch, blending once more into the crowd with her plain coat and quiet eyes. She lingered near the staff break room, pretending to wipe her glasses while she listened to the conversation inside. Derek's voice carried easily, smooth and arrogant as always. "Another whiner sent in a complaint," he said, laughing as if the words themselves were a joke. "Bridge builder, can you believe that? Sounds like someone with too much free time and not enough sense." The others chuckled with him, their laughter low but cruel, the sound of people who thought they were untouchable. One teller spoke up hesitantly, mentioning that the complaint was unusually detailed, but Derek waved his hand dismissively. "We get hundreds of those. People always want to blame the bank instead of themselves. Lost their job, missed a payment, can't read the terms. Always our fault. Ignore it. The system will file it away like the rest." His tone was final, his smirk confident, and the room dissolved into easy chatter again. Elena felt her stomach tighten, her pulse thundering at the casual way he erased the voices of the very people who gave the bank its reason to exist. She pressed her hand against her purse, feeling the familiar weight of the ledger within, grounding her as anger threatened to spill. Her father had once written that institutions reveal themselves not in their advertisements, but in how they treat the smallest voices. Here was the proof, raw and undeniable, that her branch had lost its way under Derek's leadership. Bridge Builder's words had been cast aside like dust, mocked as weakness instead of honored as truth. Elena turned away from the break room, her jaw set, her steps steady. If her team would not listen to a voice from the outside, she would make them hear it from within. Their arrogance had become their shield, but she knew arrogance always cracked when faced with evidence and power combined. She would wait, she would watch, and when the time came, she would strike with the precision her father had taught her, numbers that healed instead of wounded. Elena spent the next week digging deeper, slipping into the branch at odd hours disguised as another customer, always careful to remain unnoticed, her coat plain and her steps quiet. She knew something was rotten beyond the arrogance of dismissive employees, and her instincts told her Derek's smirk hid more than bad manners. One afternoon, she sat in a corner chair pretending to fill out forms, her eyes following Derek as he carried a thick folder into his office. When he left for a meeting, she rose calmly and walked past the open door, her gaze landing on the documents scattered across his desk. Numbers caught her attention instantly, rows of figures that did not match the quarterly report she had signed off on as CEO. Her chest tightened as she recognized the pattern. Inflated revenue streams carefully presented to look like growth, while in reality entire columns of losses were hidden. That evening she logged into the internal database from her home office, her father's ledger resting beside her as though guiding her hand. She compared Derek's branch reports against actual client accounts, her trained eyes moving swiftly through the numbers. What she uncovered made her pulse quicken. Dozens of families had been pushed into foreclosure with little warning, their accounts marked as non-compliant even when payments had been made. Penalties had been added without explanation, interest recalculated to balloon overnight, all funneling desperate customers into default. Yet on the official records, these accounts were erased, replaced by neat lines that painted the branch as thriving. The missing funds had been redirected into bonuses for senior staff, disguised as performance rewards for meeting so-called targets. Elena sat back, her fists clenched, fury building with every page she turned. It was not just Derek, it was his entire senior team. Their signatures appeared on approvals, their names linked to payouts, their complicity clear in black and white. The culture of cruelty had not been an accident. It had been a system, carefully designed to enrich the few while crushing the many. She imagined the old man with calloused hands, the young couple struggling with English, the countless others whose voices she had not heard. They were the ones paying for the suits, the bonuses, the smug laughter in the break room. She thought of her father again, the way he had bent over the kitchen table late at night, whispering that numbers told stories if you listened closely. These numbers screamed of betrayal, of a bank that had forgotten its soul. She closed the files with shaking hands, but her resolve hardened like steel. If Derek believed he could manipulate figures and bury the truth under paperwork, he had underestimated the daughter of Rafael Cruz. She would not allow Crescent to become a predator, and she would not allow her father's lessons to be mocked by men who wore expensive suits and called it success. Elena placed the ledger on her desk, running her fingers across its worn cover, then whispered softly into the quiet room. Numbers can wound, or they can heal. She vowed that soon everyone in that branch would learn the difference. Elena returned to the branch with her usual disguise, the plain coat that allowed her to pass as just another face in the endless stream of clients. Yet this time she was not watching only Derek or the managers. Her attention kept drifting toward one young teller who moved with quiet care behind the counter. Maria Santos could not have been older than 24. Her dark hair pulled back neatly, her hands quick but precise as she handled each transaction. Unlike the others, she met customers' eyes, offering small smiles that softened even the harshest complaints. Elena noticed how Derek often snapped at her, criticizing her for taking too long, reminding her that sales quotas mattered more than empathy. Each time Maria lowered her gaze, nodding silently, though Elena saw the frustration flicker in her eyes. That evening, after the branch closed, Elena lingered near the back hallway where Maria was gathering her things. She stepped forward, heart pounding, knowing this was the moment to take a risk. "You care about the people who come here," Elena said softly, her voice steady but warm. Maria looked startled, clutching her bag closer, uncertain if this stranger was friend or threat. "I try," she admitted after a pause, her voice carrying both pride and exhaustion. "But Derek says compassion doesn't pay bonuses." Elena hesitated only a moment before pulling her purse open and revealing the edge of her father's ledger. "My name is Elena Cruz," she whispered, watching Maria's eyes widen in disbelief. "I am not just another client. I founded Crescent Bank." For a moment, Maria said nothing, her mouth slightly open, her mind clearly struggling to match the woman in a plain coat with the powerful name splashed across magazines. Elena continued, her voice low but fierce. "This branch is rotten. I have seen the reports and I know the truth, but I cannot fight it alone. I need someone inside who still remembers what this place was meant to stand for." Maria's eyes softened with recognition, as if the weight of her own doubts finally found a place to rest. She glanced around to be sure they were alone, then whispered, "I have copies of documents Derek told us to hide. They show foreclosures that were never supposed to happen." The word struck Elena like a spark in dry wood. She reached out gently, her hand brushing Maria's arm in gratitude. "Can you get them to me?" Maria nodded, her jaw tight with both fear and determination. "Tomorrow, I'll slip them into your bag when no one is watching. But if Derek finds out..." Her voice trailed off, the danger unspoken but heavy in the air. Elena closed her ledger, pressing it firmly against her chest. "Then we both stand together. You will not face him alone." That night, Elena returned home with a strange mix of fear and hope. For the first time, she was not fighting in silence. She had an ally, young but brave, ready to shine light into the shadows Derek thought were safe. She knew tomorrow would bring proof, and proof was the first weapon in dismantling corruption. Elena arrived at headquarters early Monday morning, her plain coat still on her shoulders, though her expression carried none of the meekness she had worn at the branch. Maria's documents were safe in her bag, tucked beside her father's ledger, their weight reminding her of the promise she had made. She had spent half the night reviewing the files, her eyes burning as line after line confirmed what she had feared. Derek and his senior team had hidden foreclosures, adjusted balances, and siphoned profits into bonuses, She had just finished making her notes when an urgent call came from the compliance office. Regulators had flagged Crescent Bank for irregularities, and a formal review had been scheduled. They were demanding answers within 72 hours. Her breath caught as the words echoed in her ears. 72 hours. It was the same window her mother had once been given on that bitter night years ago. 3 days to leave their home because no bank would grant them mercy. The memory returned with painful clarity, her mother's hands trembling as she packed dishes into boxes, her own younger self clutching her school books with the dread of losing everything familiar. That eviction had taught her the cruelty of deadlines, how a handful of hours could change the course of an entire life. Now the same number loomed over her bank, threatening collapse if she failed. She sat at her desk, staring at the city skyline beyond the tall glass windows, her reflection faint against the glass. The regulators were not bluffing. She knew that. If Crescent was found guilty of falsifying reports and hiding losses, the fines would reach into the millions. More than money, it would destroy trust. Investors would pull out, clients would close accounts, and the empire she had built from nothing would crumble overnight. Her board would blame her, the press would devour her, and Derek would vanish with pockets lined from the damage he had caused. Elena pressed her palm against the ledger, the smooth leather grounding her as the panic threatened to overtake her. Her father had faced hardship with patience and numbers that told the truth, and she would do the same. She opened Maria's documents again, flipping through the pages until she reached the signatures that tied Derek and his team to the hidden accounts. Evidence was here, but evidence alone was not enough. She needed a plan, a way to deliver answers to regulators before the deadline struck, a way to prove Crescent was not beyond redemption. Her phone buzzed with another message, this one from Maria. Be careful. Derek suspects leaks. Elena closed her eyes for a moment, letting the warning settle. The clock was ticking. 72 hours to save not only Crescent but her father's legacy. 72 hours to show that numbers could heal instead of wound. She rose from her chair, her resolve sharper than fear. She would not let history repeat itself. Not her mother's eviction, not her father's silence, not the suffering of clients whose voices had been erased. The countdown had begun, and she would meet it head on. The branch was quiet after closing, the fluorescent lights humming faintly above rows of empty desks, the air heavy with the smell of paper and ink. Elena slipped in with her access badge, the same one that had once opened these doors for her as the celebrated founder, but now felt like a key to a crime scene. She moved quickly, her plain coat brushing against her knees as she carried her purse close. Inside it her father's ledger rested, the anchor that steadied her hands. She entered Derek's office, shutting the door softly behind her, the silence broken only by the rustle of folders as she spread them across the polished desk. Stacks of loan files towered around her, and she began the work she knew would test not only her patience but her strength. She flipped through the first folder, scanning the details. A young family in Queens who had borrowed to cover hospital bills. The official records claimed repeated missed payments, yet the receipt she found stapled inside showed they had paid on time. Interest rates had been recalculated, penalties added without explanation, until the family was buried under debt they did not owe. Elena opened her father's ledger, running her finger over his old notes about fair interest, about adjusting terms to give dignity rather than despair. Numbers can wound, or they can heal, she whispered to herself as she copied the true figures into a notebook. One file after another revealed the same ugly pattern. Loans marked as default when payments had been made, families evicted under false claims of non-compliance, assets seized at half their value, all hidden under the glossy surface of quarterly reports. Derek and his team had been meticulous, but not perfect. Elena's trained eye caught the small discrepancies, the altered dates, the mismatched signatures. Each error was another crack in their scheme, another thread she could pull until the entire fabric unraveled. Hours passed, the clock ticking toward midnight as she worked, her pen moving quickly, the ledger beside her like a quiet guide. Her eyes blurred, but her determination sharpened with every case she uncovered. She thought of the young couple turned away because of language, of the old man mocked as hopeless, of her own mother clutching an eviction notice with trembling hands. These were not just records, they were lives, and Derek had gambled them away for bonuses and status. Elena's fury grew with each page, but beneath it was sorrow, the ache of knowing Crescent had been twisted into the very monster she had sworn it would never become. By the time the clock struck 2 in the morning, her desk was covered with neatly organized evidence, handwritten notes linking the falsified files to Derek's signatures. She leaned back, rubbing her eyes, exhaustion pressing on her shoulders, but resolve burning steady in her chest. The fraud was deliberate, systemic, impossible to deny once laid bare. She placed her father's ledger on top of the files, its worn leather cover absorbing the weight of the truth. This was no longer just a battle for Crescent's survival. It was a battle for every promise she had made to herself as a child. She would expose them, and she would not fail. Elena was still gathering her notes the next morning when Derek's shadow fell across the desk, his voice cutting through the air with practiced arrogance. "And what exactly are you doing here?" he asked, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the scattered files. She lifted her head slowly, keeping her expression calm, her hand resting lightly on her father's ledger, as if it were simply another folder. "I'm reviewing inconsistencies," she answered evenly, her tone measured, careful not to reveal more than necessary. Derek gave a sharp laugh, leaning one hand on the edge of the desk, his expensive cologne filling the space like smoke. "Inconsistencies? Please. You wouldn't know what you're looking at even if it were highlighted in red. These are confidential documents. And last I checked, the cleaning staff doesn't have clearance." His words dripped with mockery, and a few passing employees slowed, curious to see the confrontation unfold. Elena felt heat rise in her chest, but forced herself to breathe steadily, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing her flinch. "Sometimes it takes fresh eyes to see what others overlook," she said, her voice low but steady. Derek smirked, straightening his tie with deliberate slowness. "Fresh eyes? Don't flatter yourself. You're lucky I don't have security throw you out right now. Maybe I should. Might be entertaining to watch you escorted through the lobby, everyone staring, whispering. You'd never set foot in another branch again." Elena tightened her grip on the ledger, her knuckles whitening under the strain. "If you did that," she replied softly, "you might be surprised at the attention it draws." Her calmness unsettled him for a moment, but he recovered quickly, his smirk widening. "Attention is exactly what I want," he said. "The board trusts me. I've delivered record numbers for this branch, numbers that keep investors smiling. You think anyone will listen to some nobody with a handful of papers and no position? I have friends on the board, people who owe me favors. They'll back me over anyone else, no matter what story you try to spin." The arrogance in his voice was so thick it almost choked the air between them. Elena felt the temptation to reveal herself right then, to cut his words short with the truth of who she was, but she held back. Not yet. Instead, she leaned forward slightly, her eyes locking with his, unblinking, her tone edged with steel. "Friends on the board don't erase the truth. Numbers don't lie, Derek. Eventually, they speak louder than loyalty." His expression flickered, irritation breaking through his composure. But he quickly masked it with another smirk. "Careful," he warned, lowering his voice to a whisper meant only for her. "People who dig too deep tend to find themselves buried. Walk away before you regret it." He turned on his heel, striding from the room with his usual swagger. But Elena did not move, her hands steady on the ledger. His threats rolled through her mind, sharp and poisonous. But beneath them, her resolve only hardened. Derek believed he had power because of friends and fear, but she knew real power came from truth. She would not be silenced, not by him, not by anyone. The boardroom lights glowed harsh against the polished table as executives filed in, their voices low with speculation about the early hour. Derek led the group with the same smug confidence that had colored his every step, his tailored suit sharp, his expression relaxed as if the meeting were simply another stage on which he could perform. His team followed close behind, laughing quietly, certain their fabricated reports and falsified profits would once again pass unchallenged. Not one of them suspected that the ground beneath their feet was about to shift. Papers shuffled, coffee cups clinked, and a hush settled over the room as the heavy double doors opened. Elena stepped inside without her plain coat, dressed in a dark tailored suit that carried the authority of her position. Her heels struck the floor with quiet certainty, each step measured and steady, her father's ledger tucked neatly under her arm like a weapon cloaked in leather. For a moment no one spoke, confusion rippling through the room as recognition dawned. The woman Derek had mocked at the door, the so-called nobody he had threatened in whispers, now stood revealed as the founder and CEO of Crescent Bank. Shock-widened eyes, coffee cups paused halfway to lips, the silence pressing heavier with each second. Derek's smirk faltered, his face draining of color before he forced a chuckle trying to mask his unease. "Well, this is unexpected," he said, his voice too loud, echoing in the still room. "Madam Cruz, we didn't know you would be joining us this morning." Elena set the ledger on the table, its worn cover a contrast to the sleek technology surrounding it, and let her gaze sweep the room. "I called this meeting," she replied, her voice steady and clear. "And from this moment, you will understand exactly why." The executives shifted in their seats, exchanging nervous glances, but Elena kept her eyes fixed on Derek. He tried to recover his swagger, leaning back in his chair with forced ease. "If this is about performance, you'll find our numbers exceed every projection. This branch is the jewel of Crescent." His words rang hollow, bouncing against the silence that followed. Elena opened the ledger, not to read but to remind herself of the anchor it provided, then slid a stack of documents onto the table. "Your numbers are lies," she said simply, her tone sharp enough to slice through the air. "You've hidden foreclosures, manipulated payments, and pocketed bonuses while families lost their homes. I have proof, and regulators will see it within 72 hours. Murmurs broke out around the table, voices rising in disbelief and alarm, but Elena held firm, her presence commanding the room. Derek's forced grin faltered further, sweat beginning to bead at his temple. "You think the board will believe you over me?" he challenged, his voice cracking slightly under the strain. Elena leaned forward, her gaze unwavering. "I am not asking them to believe me. I'm showing them the truth. And truth does not bend to arrogance or alliances." Silence fell again, heavier now, as the weight of her words settled on every man and woman in the room. For the first time, Derek looked small, his swagger stripped away by the undeniable authority of the woman he had underestimated. Elena had revealed herself, not as a helpless outsider, but as the leader he had mocked in ignorance. The game had changed, and the boardroom knew it. The room was tense as Elena connected her laptop to the projector, the screen flickering to life at the front of the boardroom. Executives leaned forward uneasily, some clutching their pens tighter, others whispering in low voices, but all eyes shifted back to her as the first document appeared. Elena's voice carried calm precision as she pointed to the figures displayed, the neat columns that Derek had once paraded as proof of success. "This is the official report filed by this branch," she said, her tone even but sharp enough to cut through the silence. She clicked to the next slide, revealing the original account records Maria had saved, numbers that told a different story. "And this," Elena continued, "is the truth." Gasps rippled around the table as the discrepancies appeared side by side. Families listed as delinquent when receipts proved payments had been made, homes foreclosed despite agreements signed for extensions, balances inflated with unexplained penalties. Each example struck like a hammer against the walls of arrogance Derek had built. Elena did not rush. She moved steadily, methodically, her father's ledger resting open beside her as if its quiet wisdom gave her strength. She pulled up video clips next, security footage of Derek instructing staff to push high-interest loans onto vulnerable clients. His own words condemning him more effectively than any accusation could. "Targets matter more than feelings," his voice boomed from the speakers, filling the room with its cruelty. Elena's eyes scanned the board as the weight of evidence sank in. Some executives shifted uncomfortably, others looked down, unable to meet her gaze, but none could deny what they were seeing. She advanced to the next slide, a series of customer complaints logged under her pseudonym, and others like it, each one dismissed, ignored, or mocked. She read aloud fragments, her voice steady, letting the raw words of clients speak for themselves. "Bridge builder," she said softly, "was one of mine, filed to test how complaints were handled. You laughed at it, Derek. You called it whining. But every line in it was true." For the first time, Derek sat rigid, his usual smirk frozen, his tongue caught in silence. He reached for a glass of water, his hand trembling as Elena continued. "Maria Santos," she said, her voice warming slightly, "risked her job to save copies of these files before Derek ordered them destroyed. Without her courage, this truth might still be hidden. She represents the values Crescent was founded on, values we have lost under Derek's leadership." She gestured toward Maria, who sat quietly at the end of the table, her face pale but determined. Several board members nodded in recognition, their gazes softening as they regarded her. Elena turned back to the screen, her voice rising with finality. This bank was built to be a bridge, not a weapon. Every falsified file, every family displaced, every client silenced was a betrayal not only of our mission, but of every principle my father taught me. Numbers can wound, or they can heal. Derek chose to wound. I will not allow it to continue. The final slide glowed with undeniable proof, dates and signatures binding Derek and his team to the fraud. The silence that followed was absolute, heavy with the truth laid bare. Derek opened his mouth as if to argue, but no words came. For the first time, the man who always had something to say was left speechless, crushed beneath the weight of evidence he could not escape. The silence after Elena's final slide lingered heavy in the room, the weight of truth pressing down on every corner of the polished boardroom table. Derek sat stiff in his chair, his jaw tight, sweat glistening at his temples, though he tried to hide it with a forced grin. His team shifted nervously, some looking at their shoes, others glancing at the board members as if hoping for rescue. But no rescue came. Only Elena standing tall at the head of the room, her father's ledger resting like a silent witness at her side. She let the silence stretch until even the ticking clock on the wall seemed louder than the shallow breaths of the guilty. Then, with her voice steady and cold, she spoke. "Derek Mallory, you are terminated immediately." Gasps broke out. Chairs scraped as executives leaned forward in disbelief. Derek jumped to his feet, his face flushing red, his voice rising with desperate bluster. "You can't fire me on the spot. I've delivered record profits. I have friends on the board who will not allow this." Elena's gaze did not waver. "What you delivered were lies built on the suffering of families you cast aside. What you gave this bank was poison, and today that poison ends." She turned her eyes toward the security guard standing at the back of the room, summoned at her request before the meeting began. "Escort Mr. Mallory out of this building. His access is revoked." The guard stepped forward, firm but professional, and Derek's protest grew shriller. "This is outrageous. I built this branch. You'll regret humiliating me. I'll sue for wrongful termination." But no one rose to defend him, not even the allies who had laughed with him in the break room. His words sounded small against the undeniable evidence Elena had revealed. As the guards took his arms, he twisted in vain, shouting empty threats that echoed hollow in the air. Employees gathered near the hallway outside, drawn by the noise, their faces wide with shock as they watched the man who had ruled with arrogance drag past them. For the first time, they saw him powerless. Elena did not stop there. She turned her sharp gaze on the rest of Derek's senior team, each one shrinking under her eyes. "You signed off on falsified reports. You pocketed bonuses built on deception. You failed not only this institution but every client who trusted us. Your employment is terminated effective immediately." The words fell like stones, final and undeniable. The guards moved again, collecting stunned managers who sputtered excuses, their polished shoes squeaking against the marble floor as they were escorted out one by one. Employees whispered to each other in the hallways, stunned by the spectacle. But beneath their surprise was something more, the flicker of respect for the woman who had built Crescent and now was reclaiming it. Elena stood at the doorway, her voice carrying across the watching crowd. This bank was built to serve people, not prey on them. If anyone here believes otherwise, leave now. There is no place in Crescent for cruelty disguised as success. Her tone was calm, her face composed, but her words struck like lightning, shattering the fear that had allowed corruption to grow. As Derek's shouts faded into silence beyond the lobby doors, Elena knew the rot had been cut away. The rebuilding could finally begin. The following morning, the air in the branch felt different, lighter, as if a storm had passed and left the promise of renewal behind. Employees gathered in the main lobby, some nervous, others hopeful, all waiting to hear what would come next. Elena stood before them, no disguise this time, her tailored suit sharp, her posture steady, her father's ledger resting on the podium in front of her. The same people who had once walked past her without a glance now watched with full attention. She let the quiet settle for a moment before speaking, her voice calm but carrying a weight that silenced every whisper. "Yesterday we removed those who betrayed Crescent's mission. Today we begin again." Her words spread through the room like a current. She outlined her reforms with precision, each one drawn not from spreadsheets but from the lessons in the ledger she carried. First, she announced a fair loan program designed to give families time and dignity, with interest rates capped and penalties reviewed by independent auditors to prevent abuse. Murmurs of approval rose from tellers and junior staff who had long watched clients walk away in despair. Elena continued, declaring that every branch would offer multilingual support so no customer would be dismissed or mocked because of language. Translators would be hired, training materials would be available in multiple languages, and community outreach would be prioritized. For those who had seen couples struggle to explain themselves in broken English, the change felt revolutionary. She then turned to the employees themselves, acknowledging their struggles, the long hours, the impossible quotas that had pressured them into silence. She announced scholarships for staff education, programs to help tellers pursue degrees or certifications, opportunities for growth that were once reserved only for the privileged. Faces brightened, some eyes filled with tears, the promise of upward mobility stirring hope where fear had long lived. "This bank will rise with you, not on your backs," Elena said, her voice steady but warm. Then she called Maria Santos forward, the young teller who had risked her job to save the truth. Maria stepped hesitantly, her hands trembling slightly, but Elena placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. Maria chose courage when others chose silence. For that, she will lead the way in our reforms. Elena announced her promotion to Director of Community Lending, a role that would allow her to shape policies that touch the lives of thousands. Applause erupted, genuine and thunderous, filling the lobby with a sound that felt like rebirth. Maria's cheeks flushed with disbelief, but her eyes shone with determination as she met Elena's gaze. Within days, letters and phone calls went out to customers who had been turned away. Families who once felt discarded were invited back, offered fair terms, treated with respect. Former clients returned cautiously, but word spread quickly that Crescent was changing. In place of arrogance, there was compassion. In place of greed, there was dignity. Elena walked through the branch quietly, watching the transformation with steady eyes, her father's words echoing in her heart. Numbers can wound, or they can heal. For the first time in years, Crescent was choosing to heal. 6 months later, the top floor of Crescent headquarters glowed with morning light, the glass walls reflecting a city that now spoke of renewal instead of decline. Elena sat at her polished walnut desk, her posture straight, her eyes calm as she scanned the quarterly reports spread before her. For the first time in years, the numbers told a story she could be proud of. Community lending had grown by 29%, customer retention by 26%, and even the investors who once questioned her reforms now praised the stability they brought. Each figure was more than a statistic. It was a family who had kept their home, a student who had secured tuition, a worker who had been given fair credit instead of crushing debt. On her desk rested a small frame that held her father's ledger, its worn leather preserved behind clear glass, its handwritten notes a silent reminder of where it all began. She looked at it often, finding strength in the faded ink, the calculations her father had once explained at their kitchen table. Numbers can wound, or they can heal. Those words echoed in her memory as she signed off on decisions, a compass that kept her steady in rooms where arrogance and greed still tried to whisper. Today, that ledger was no longer a private anchor hidden in her purse. It was a legacy displayed proudly in the heart of her office. The newspapers lay stacked neatly in the corner, their headlines bold. Crescent CEO rebuilds trust in banking. Elena Cruz turns crisis into community growth. Reporters wrote of her as the woman who had redefined leadership in finance. But Elena knew the truth was simpler. She had not reinvented the wheel. She had only returned to the values her father had taught her: dignity, fairness, and compassion woven into the numbers. Yet the impact was undeniable. Crescent had become a symbol of possibility, a bank that stood apart from competitors who still measured success only in profit margins. Her assistant stepped in to remind her of the board meeting in 15 minutes, and Elena nodded, gathering the reports with steady hands. She glanced once more at the ledger before rising, the sunlight glinting off the glass, as if blessing her path. Walking through the halls, she was greeted by employees who now lifted their heads high, their greetings warm and genuine. Some spoke to her in Spanish, others in English or Mandarin, and she answered each in kind, A bridge between worlds where once only walls had stood. As she entered the boardroom, the directors rose. A gesture of respect she had not asked for, but which spoke volumes. She smiled, not with arrogance, but with quiet confidence, ready to guide them through a future where dignity would never again be treated as weakness. She set the reports before her, the numbers shining bright, then looked around the table and saw not just colleagues but partners in change. Elena allowed herself a small breath of gratitude before she began. The bank was strong, her people were stronger, and the ledger's legacy lived on. If this story moved you like it moved us, don't forget to give it a like. And if you want more stories like this one, hit subscribe. We'd love to have you with us.